Welcome to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. The Vancouver Writers Fest connects people to exceptional books, ideas, and dialogue through year-round programming that ignites a passion for words and the world around us. I'm Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director, and I'm pleased to be sharing this conversation with journalist and best-selling author Susan Orlean in conversation with Globe and Mail editor Mark Medley. This event was recorded as part of our festival in October 2021, which is held in Vancouver, British Columbia. The Vancouver Writers Fest carries out its work, including this event you're about to listen to, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. This event features Susan Orlean and Mark Medley in conversation about Susan's most recent book, On Animals, a book of essays spanning 25 years that celebrates the crucial connection between animals and people. And, as the New York Times put it, every essay in this book is magnificent. Here are Susan Orlean and Mark Medley.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Leslie. It is a real pleasure to be here to talk to one of not only my favorite journalists, but one of my favorite writers working today. Susan Orlean has been a staff writer at The New Yorker for almost 30 years. Her books include Rin Tin Tin, speaking of animals, as well as the library book, The Orchid Thief, which was made into the Academy Award-winning film adaptation, and Saturday Night, which might be my personal favorite. She joins us today to discuss her latest book, On Animals, which collects her articles and essays on the subjects of dogs, cats, chickens, donkeys, mules, rabbits, orcas, lions, tigers, and bears. Well, panda bears, that she has written over the past several decades. I'm sitting here in Toronto in the afternoon. It's still morning here, or it's still morning in LA, but we're going to pretend we are both sitting on stage in Vancouver. So please welcome Susan Orlean.
Hey, Mark, and thank you so much for having me as part of the fest. This is the miracle of technology that is, we're grateful for. I wish I were in Vancouver because it is one of my favorite cities, but next time we'll do it in person. It struck me as I was preparing for this talk that it's actually quite fitting. We're talking about animals because I don't know if you remember, but the first time I met you in person, we were in Iceland and we went horseback riding on Icelandic ponies one morning or afternoon with a bunch of Oh my God, I forgot that. And I was just looking at those pictures the other day, believe it or not, and realizing this was sort of a life goal that I was achieving, which was to go horseback riding on an Icelandic pony. That was what, 10 years ago?
10 years ago. It was like I was preparing for this event even then, and I didn't know it.
That's great. And me too. I guess I was preparing for this book and I didn't know it.
There you go. So as I mentioned, you're talking to us from LA, where you've lived most of the last 10 years when you're not at your farm in the Hudson Valley, which is the setting for many of the pieces in this collection and which readers have really gotten to know, I think, over the years, even if they've never visited it in person. Minor spoiler alert, but I was surprised to learn reading this book that you recently sold the farm. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it was a decision that I think was a wise one, but it was certainly something I never thought we would do. I always thought I'll be buried here. This is the place that's going to be our legacy. We will always have it. Quite honestly, it was a bit of a COVID decision. We live in LA. Getting back and forth from LA to New York became suddenly a kind of daunting prospect. We really had no idea what the future would hold. Was travel always going to be so compromised? Would it be increasingly difficult for us to get there? Add to that, and this might sound funny, but actually our animals were part of the equation. We have currently 2 dogs and a cat. Every time we wanted to go to the farm, we had to deal with Are we taking the animals? How are we going to get them there? And for the last many years in the summer, my husband would drive across country with the animals. And, transporting pets is not easy. In a perfect world, there would be an airline that would let you bring your dog on board as long as it was well behaved. But that isn't the way it works. So we had to deal with the question of, do we want to send them as cargo, which is, people do it all the time, but it's stressful. And as my dog got older, I really began worrying that that was just going to be too stressful for her to do a long flight twice in a summer. So, essentially we were confronting the impracticality of living on two coasts. And one day my husband and I both looked at each other and said, we should sell the farm. And both of us were shocked. Like, did you say that? Did I say that? And it was a really tough decision. I still can't believe we did it, but I think it was probably a very smart, not smart, wise, mature.
It's kind of ironic. Most of the people I know have been fleeing big cities for farms during the course of the pandemic. And you were already living in LA, but in a way, you doubled down on urban living and got rid of your country place. What do you miss most about it? I'm not sure if it happened this past summer or the summer before, but, in the book, you describe the farm or Farmville, as you call it in the final essay. It comes across as very idyllic, and to the point that as I was reading the book, I have to admit, I found myself looking up listings for hobby farms here in Ontario because it was the kind of thing that I wanted to do. So, what is it about the farm that you miss?
It is idyllic. And I don't want to be sentimental and absurd. Country living has its own challenges, mm-hmm. and you aren't suddenly elevated into some utopia, but there's a closeness with nature that is really dreamy. And for me, it was this wish fulfillment of really being able to live with animals. There was almost no limit to what kind of animals we could have or how many we could have, although at some point it becomes a challenge to manage them. But the way that animals are so woven into the life on a farm was a real dream come true for me. And in fact, if you have animals, if you have livestock, their needs set the rhythm for your day. That becomes the urgency of your day, which is the animals need to be fed. They need water. They need their coop cleaned out. There's an elemental quality to it that is very appealing, particularly if your work life is very much in the abstract, imperfectible world of creativity. The fact of the concrete need for taking care of animals is really gratifying. It's a very specific thing. And, for those of us who write, there's always this feeling that a piece of writing can never be perfect. Of course, that just doesn't exist. There is no such thing. So it's not even a goal that you can aspire to, because there is no such thing as a perfect piece of writing. So you're always laboring in this world where you'll never be fully satisfied. And, that's the nature of being a writer or being an artist, that it is impossible. You're not running a widget factory where you can stamp the perfect widget. Taking care of animals has a very clear, achievable quality to it, which is you wake up in the morning, the animals need to be fed, you go out and feed them, they're happy. And it's so satisfying. So I do feel like I miss that quality. I miss feeling needed, although I have 2 dogs and a cat. And believe me, they make sure that I'm aware of their needs like 24 hours a day. But I have a soft spot for livestock. I love my pets, obviously, and I have a very intimate relationship with my pets. But I loved having livestock. I loved having animals that I cared for, that were not pets, but they developed a trust in me because I took care of them. And that felt really good.
Now, you have been writing about animals far before you ever moved to a farm, but I'm curious, do you think living on a farm and being immersed with animals made you a better writer when it comes to writing about animals?
Oh, definitely. I think immersion is a huge part of how you go to the next level as a writer. The more time that you are able to spend with your subject and really get it into your bones at a level that is really almost intuitive. So being around animals in that everyday way, first of all, I wrote a lot about my specific animals, mm-hmm. but I think it also made me think a lot actively about the whole question of coexisting with animals. What does it mean? What do we owe them? What does it require of us? What does being wild mean? What does being domesticated mean? So those were questions that lived in my daily life in a way that really enriched my thinking about the subject. And I think I went into these stories with a deeper appreciation of some of those fundamental questions.
One of the people you quote in one of the first articles in this collection, I think it's the one about getting into chickens yourself, is a man named Bud Wood, and he's the president of a chicken hatchery or company of some kind. And he's quoted as saying, "When times are tough, people want chickens." And I actually wanted to apply that to the pandemic, because one of the subplots of this last year and a half, especially spring and summer of 2020, was how it emphasized or underscored our reliance on animals. You know, there were countless stories about how difficult it was to adopt a dog or a cat because people were rushing out to acquire, a companion. And, it was kind of interesting when we are facing one of the scariest or most destabilizing things any of us had faced in our lifetimes. What we do is we seek comfort in animals. I'm curious, what did you make of society's kind of like collective rush towards finding new pets?
And believe me, I was part of that. I got another dog during
Really?
COVID. Yeah, we got a puppy, and we had no plans to get another dog. I mean, I think it's fascinating on many, many levels. Number one, a lot of people who had put off getting a dog because they weren't home enough, they didn't think they had time to raise a puppy, suddenly we're home. And, I think for a lot of people who had deferred getting a dog or a pet, this was a moment where they suddenly thought, well, I'm home anyway. This is ideal. And they went and got their dog that they had planned at some point to get. But I think on an emotional level, it was more profound rather than simply pragmatic. As you said, this was one of the strangest, most disorienting moments in history. Certainly for anyone currently alive, I can't think of another circumstance that would have been so disorienting. I'm sure the Spanish flu epidemic was equally disorienting, but very few people are alive now who were alive then. So I think it's safe to say that this was, for the people alive on Earth currently, a really frightening surreal experience. We certainly gravitated toward people. And I found myself reaching out to friends who I hadn't talked to in ages, talking to my family every day, really responding as if, there had just been an earthquake, and just sort of checking in. Are you okay? I'm okay. But the urge to have the comfort of a pet was universal. I mean, we have kept dogs as pets for millennia. And yes, it probably originated with them serving as guard animals, but at some point it transmogrified into a choice that we made simply because we got some emotional satisfaction out of it. Most of our pets now don't do any work for us. And, they may bark when someone rings the doorbell, but big deal. They're really not service animals. We have them because on a very primal level, they give us comfort, satisfaction, pleasure, companionship. What could be more suited to the moment than a pet when you feel you're home all the time, you're frightened, you're confused, and there's your pet who is just in an unconditional way your companion. I also have to say, and I think this is kind of, nobody's really explored this, and I think it's a little kind of disheartening to say, but I think for a lot of us, it was also a moment when the behavior of our fellow humans was very disturbing. Mm-hmm. And yes, we gravitated towards our friends and family, and in a very deep way. But I also think there was a feeling of people are terrible. People aren't being helpful. People aren't doing what they need to do. Not all people, but some people. And certainly in the United States, there was the really quite stressful and divisive experience of the election and the Black Lives Matter movement, and a feeling of choosing sides, so that unfortunately in a crisis, what you hope results from it is a feeling of community embrace. And that does happen, and it did happen, but unfortunately it didn't cross completely. There was not a moment of people all saying, hey, we're in this together. So I happen to think that the sort of race toward animals was also a way of turning away from the disappointment and frustration of the division in our culture and saying, you know what, bottom line, dogs are on our team.
They're reliable, they're predictable.
Yeah, and they're not going to be petty. They're not going to be argumentative. They're not going to challenge us on core beliefs. They're going to say, hey, you're God. You are the best thing I've ever seen in my life. And, I mean, unfortunately, I think that's a bit of the dark side of why we wanted pets so much, was a little bit of disappointment in our fellow humans.
Yeah. Now, moving on to kind of writing about animals, as long as you've been a writer, you've been writing about animals, and I don't mean just professionally. Tell us about Herbert the nearsighted pigeon, which you kind of talk about in the introductory essay in the collection. What is the story behind Herbert and kind of how you started writing about animals in the first place?
Well, Herbert the nearsighted pigeon was, as far as I know, my first book. I wrote it, according to family legend, when I was about 5 years old. It was a limited edition of one. I wrote it and illustrated it and bound it and did all the marketing myself, which was to my parents. It was the story of a pigeon who begins to feel that his friends are ignoring him and he feels lonely and sad. And then he discovers that he needs glasses and he hasn't even been greeting his friends because he hasn't been able to see them clearly. It was an amazing story. But I thought it was interesting that the protagonists of my childhood stories were so often animals. Lots of kids write little books and stories. So I don't mean to suggest I was some sort of incredible prodigy, although I did write it when I was quite young. But I immediately gravitated toward having animals as the main characters rather than a little girl who couldn't see her friends or a little boy. Instead, there was a way that animals stood as a kind of pure and ideal protagonist. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to make it sound overly sophisticated, but I do think that the non-specificness of an animal always appealed to me as the main character in a story. And this is something that, when I wrote Rin Tin Tin, one of the things I was puzzling over is why were animals so popular as protagonists in film in early Hollywood? Now, number one, they could be paid a lot less. But number two, we can rally around a dog protagonist, really regardless of our gender, our race, our ethnicity. And, a dog isn't you relate to an actor as it's someone who reminds you of someone you know, or they are the same ethnicity as you are, or they're a different ethnicity. You have all sorts of human reactions to another human. With an animal, it's a very freeing kind of association. They kind of have a purity of purpose in a story that is really ideal. They transcend all those specific characteristics. And I think even as a kid, I responded to that.
Jumping ahead from Herbert, the nearsighted pigeon, to Show Dog, which I believe is the earliest piece that appears in the collection. It dates from 1995. It's about a show dog named Biff, who I believe, if I'm remembering it, he was a boxer, right?
Yeah, he was a boxer.
I'm curious, was that the first piece that you published professionally about an animal? I mean, you were at the New Yorker already by that point, but had you written about animals before that, or was that kind of your first appearance?
Wow, that's a great question. As far as I know, yes. Because nothing comes to mind before that, that where I wrote a full-length feature about an animal. In fact, I'm pretty sure that I didn't. I might have written humor pieces, but that's a whole different category. I think that probably was the first full-length feature. And in that case, interestingly, I wanted very much for this to be really about the dog. And of course, it turned out to be very much about the people around the dog, because all stories about animals ultimately are stories about people. But my impulse behind the story was, what is the life of a show dog? I mean, you're a professional who is essentially a supermodel. So what's the day? Do you play with bones still? Do you sleep in a in a fluffy bed? Do you chew on the furniture legs? I mean, do you do dog things, or are you strictly this professional model who doesn't have doggy impulses anymore?
I bring up show dog not only because I was curious if you'd written about animals before that, but I think it's the piece that introduces a really interesting question. And one, as a journalist, I'm interested in your answer to. There's a scene, I don't know if it's in the piece itself or in the introduction, where you talk about how you had convinced his owners and his trainers to allow you, some one-on-one time with Biff as he prepares for his next, show. And you find yourself in the garage with him and sit down with your notepad. And after a few minutes, you kind of write down, you look at your only note, and it's dogs can't talk. So I'm curious. I mean, animals can't talk unless, you're dealing with a parrot. You can't know what they're thinking beyond things like, hunger, contentment, or worry, kind of, superficial things that, if you're an owner of a pet, you get to know. Being able to talk to your subject is important, and ask them about their inner lives is one of the kind of key tools I think a journalist has at his or her disposal. So I'm curious, how do you navigate the lack of this? And is it a challenge you enjoy?
It's absolutely a challenge. And of course, I was kind of making fun of myself with that anecdote about Biff, but it also was a sort of reminder to myself that I was entering a world of reporting that had a built-in problem. As you say very accurately, you can't, through language, ascertain anything about the inner life of animals. You can guess at it, and they indicate some pretty elemental needs and wishes and desires, but the stock and trade in profiles, at the very least, is I'm going to take you into the inner life of this person and how their mind works and how they look at the world. And I had set up this challenge for myself where that was simply going to be impossible. So what do you do about that? I mean, do you say, well, it can't be done? No, I think you just have to retool what it is that you're seeking, and with appreciation of the parameters of your subject. Now, certainly, without a question, there is almost no story about animals that isn't ultimately a story about the people around the animals, even the wildest of animals. I mean, I don't think it would be that interesting to read a story about a completely wild animal. I mean, if you're a naturalist, sure, you describe in detail the way it walks around, where it sleeps, all the particulars of its life. That isn't narrative journalism. That's a naturalist log, basically. So there isn't a story about animals that doesn't, by extension, talk about the people who come into contact with that animal. In the case of the show dog, it became very clear to me quickly that the story was about all of what we project onto a show dog. And to go back to my original question, which is how much of him is still a dog who will dig a hole in the backyard and throw up on your living room rug, and yet he's valued at a huge amount of money, and he gets paid to breed with other show dogs. He lives this very rarefied life, but he is still a dog. And that is, so I kind of shifted my journalistic aspirations, so to speak, to kind of contextualizing these animals. And, I think it's very foolish to try to imagine the inner life of animals, unless you're a biologist or zoologist and you really are equipped to do that. For me, it was much more this bigger question is, how do we live with these alien beings that are in our lives, whether it's a show dog or a mule or an orca? How is it that we deal with them? What do we project on them? Because there's such a huge amount of projection that we do. It's perfectly natural to project onto animals what we think they think. And, that became the goal journalistically. And that's very different from profiling a person, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, and not only that, the way I read it is, each of these pieces, you could read them as a profile of an animal or an animal person, but at the same time, you use them as jumping off points to investigate and interrogate larger issues. So, the piece on orcas turns out to be a piece on, should we keep, large aquatic creatures in captivity? The piece about the lion, the lion guy in South Africa, it's, about trophy hunting and South Africa's conservation strategies. And so, not these pieces aren't specifically about, a dog or a cat or a whale. They're all about bigger issues as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is, probably the only one that is explicitly kind of built as a story about an animal is the show dog, because I use the conventions of a profile and applied it to a dog. But the other ones are really, I think they all operate much more as an examination of this space where we overlap with animals, whether it's a domestic animal or a wild animal. And what is that space like? And many times it's really confounding and confusing. I mean, the story about this rabbit pandemic, in terms of me examining the way we think of rabbits, I mean, that was what the piece was all about. How do we react to this creature that exists in by the millions all around the world? And we have a funny relationship to them. Not to mention this eerie parallel with COVID, which was, I mean, honestly, almost chilling, because the parallels were so explicit. And, it really is about viruses. And
you would have started writing that before COVID. I know it was published during the pandemic, but it predates, I imagine, the pandemic, doesn't it?
No, in fact, as it happens, over the summer, we were at our farm and my stepson and his wife had fled Manhattan and were living with us up at the farm, and they have a pet rabbit. And they were saying to me, we couldn't get her nails clipped because the vet clinic is closed. And I said, well, why was it closed? Because of COVID? And they said, no, because there's some virus that broke out in the clinic and they had to close it and, sterilize it. And so instantly in my head, I thought, we're living in COVID times and you're telling me about this other virus outbreak in an entirely different population. That is weird. And, at that moment, the New Yorker was really focused on covering COVID. Understandably, this was the worst moment in COVID. This was the summer before last. Mm-hmm. Pre-vaccination, it was a terrible moment. And the magazine, very understandably, was trying to save as much of the space in the magazine for COVID stories as possible. And I came to my editor and I said, look, I know this sounds weird. It's a story about rabbits, but it's very much a story about pandemics about contagion in a way that is, well suited to a moment when the magazine is trying to cover COVID. And that's why they made the space for it.
As you've mentioned, and kind of as we've discussed, these pieces are just as much about humans as animals. I mean, you could have, in a way, this book could be called On Animal People if you wanted.
Right. Yeah, actually, it could have.
In many cases, the animals are more interesting than the people themselves. And so I'm curious, as somebody who spent now, 25 years, 30 years meeting some of the most interesting, eccentric, strange animal people there are. I mean, what have you learned about the human-animal relationship? And I don't mean, the relationship between people who have a cat or a dog. But, in most of these cases, these are people who have chosen to devote their lives to animals or be surrounded by animals, 24/7. I mean, what kind of people are these?
There's a fine line between enjoying animals, loving animals, and being an animal person. And this is true. I've written about obsession over and over again in my career. And there's a curiosity that I have about it that I think is deeply connected to being a journalist, which is journalists in a way can't afford to have obsessions. We need to be nimble enough to move from one story to the next. We can't fall in love with a subject. We need to, be able to shut the door and move on. So, and I think by nature, I've always had a resistance to having any identity attached to me. I feel like I don't even want to be called an animal person. I mean, I love animals, but I don't want people to say, oh, you're an animal person, because I'm not an animal person. I mean, I love animals. I enjoy being where I love, it's something I think about a lot where I'm traveling somewhere. It's on my mind to respond to the animals I may find in that place. I definitely have an attachment to animals. But the moment you begin identifying more strongly with your obsession than with your integrity as a person, you have gone over into that place that becomes very interesting to me and somewhat alienating. It makes me think, how can you devote yourself so singularly to this, whatever it is, orchids, Rin Tin Tin, rabbits, whatever. I have a persistent curiosity and I think I have a dis-ease with it, if I may use that word, which is, what does that mean? And why can't I identify so strongly with something? And at the same time, it's like, I don't want to identify so strongly with something. It seems like you lose a little piece of yourself when you become so obsessed with something outside yourself. At the same time, there's a great deal of comfort that comes from that. And, I really explored this a lot with The Orchid Thief, that the idea of having a goal, which is to collect every species of orchid, it gives your life a lot of order. You wake up on a Saturday and you know what you're going to do with your day, which is to go to an orchid show and see if you can find a species that you haven't collected yet. Or you're planning a trip to Colombia to collect a rare species. It's a very, it establishes parameters to your life that I think feel very comforting. And, you could extend that to say it provides for a lot of people what religion provides for other people, which is an order, a set of rules, a set of goals, a set of instructions for how to live your life. So that I do see that as a through line with a lot of what I'm interested in, not solely, not exclusively, but there's no doubt that comes up again and again, that you make a certain external thing the parameter of your life's desires, and everything falls into place. And people need that. I mean, it's a very human need to have order in your life. And as I said, living on a farm, I felt a satisfaction in thinking, oh, I have an order in my life. I have to wake up in the morning. It doesn't matter how tired I am or how hungover I am. I've got to go and feed the chickens. Human beings are probably too smart, and we get a little lost in our intellectual power, and then life can seem very befuddling. Like, what do you do? What's the meaning of life? And some people satisfy that urge with something very, very concrete. Like, I want to make a lot of money. That's my life goal. That's what I organize my decisions around, which is I want to make a lot of money. Or I want to raise my children to be perfect humans. And that's how I'm going to organize my life. I mean, we just have a natural need for that. And animals absolutely provide that for a lot of people. Either an obsession with a particular individual animal or a general kind of fascination with a particular species, for instance. Or, in the case of the story of Keiko, this was like a intense focus by many, many people on one individual animal. And, huge amounts of money devoted to it, a kind of singular wish, which is we need to train this orca to be wild again and return to the ocean to live the rest of his life as a wild animal.
I'm curious, and I'm kind of acknowledging the time. I don't want to rush us through the remaining questions, but I'm curious, as somebody who I never considered you to be, an animal writer or a journalist who focuses on animals, even though, you'd written Rin Tin Tin and I read, probably half of these pieces before. I'm curious when the time came to collect the articles and essays that made up this book, if you were kind of surprised by how much a part of your career animals have actually been. Because I imagine, you didn't include every single piece you've ever written in the book.
I was very surprised. My interests range wildly. And I've absolutely resisted being categorized. I mean, after I wrote The Orchid Thief, I was asked to write 1 million stories about plants and even about orchids. And I thought, no. I don't want to go back to that. I'm done with that. Partly because my interests had been exhausted, but also I had a fear, and this goes back to what we were just saying. I thought, I don't want to be identified as a plant writer. I'm not a plant writer. Similarly, when I realized, wow, I've written a lot of stories about animals, but I would never want to be, I don't identify myself as an animal writer. And I would hope that I wouldn't be seen that way. I think that I'm more a writer about noticing the world around me And I mean, that may sound kind of generic, but do I notice animals more than other people? Probably, because I like animals. So I notice those stories maybe more than someone who really doesn't like animals or just is not interested in them at all. But and there is a little bit of danger of thinking, am I now going to be identified as an animal writer? But to tell you the truth, I could have collected, I have two other collections, one which is a profile of unusual people, and the other which was a collection of stories about place, that really explored the kind of texture of places. So I have, kind of filtered chunks of my work previously that are equally dominant in the kinds of stories that I choose.
This book to me felt almost like a conclusion, like perhaps you've said everything you want to say about animals, especially learning that you've, sold the farm. Am I reading too much into it? Or, do you think this kind of chapter of your career is over? Or are there kind of like other animals you want to write about, animal people that you can't wait to talk to?
Oh, that's a really interesting point. I think that I'm always going to be a little attuned to stories that involve animals and have an enjoyment in doing it that other people might not. But I probably, out of my my own kind of discomfort with being identified or labeled too completely as this kind of writer or that kind of writer, I probably wouldn't do an animal story immediately, or I probably pace them carefully. It was funny because the New Yorker had an idea about another animal story. And I thought, the last piece I did for the magazine was about the rabbit pandemic. Do I really want to do another animal story right away? And I began doing a little reporting about it, but I could feel myself thinking, this is a little too familiar. This feels like I'm going over previously plowed territory, but also my own feeling of I don't want people to think that this is the only thing I do.
I'm going to kind of contradict my previous question and ask, as you were compiling these pieces and I think reading them for the first time, since many of them had been published, since, you've written about how you don't usually read your stories once they're in print. I'm curious, when you return to some of these pieces, was there any particular one that jumped out and you kind of felt, this could have been a book in another life, or there's more to say about this particular animal or subject?
Yeah, well, actually, I have an unusual answer to that, which was after I finished writing the story about Keiko, I decided to do it as a book.
Oh.
And I began reporting, and I think it would have been a terrific book. I discovered a little way into reporting it that someone else was also working on a book about him. And I did not want to be running parallel with another writer. And I regret the decision to bail on it. But I had never worked on a project before where somebody was literally next to me. We were in the same places at the same time because the story was unfolding in real time. And I just thought this is, and also he had a relationship with one of the important characters in it that, they were old friends. And I felt that was going to get in the way for me.
That kind of reminds me of the story of when GQ and Esquire were both working on a piece about that zoo in, I think, Ohio or Illinois, where all the animals escaped, and they published the same day. You know, it must be a weird experience as a journalist when you know, the competition or a peer is working on exactly what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, it's, 99% of the time I don't have that problem because nobody seems to be interested in these stories, which is either, I mean, I don't even know how to interpret that, but you know what I mean? It's one of these things where you think, oh my God, I mean, nobody else thinks this is an interesting story, damn it. But the few times it's happened, it's very uncomfortable. And it's so funny because so many people, like people who write about politics or science, I mean, they're very used to it. It happens all the time and they just do their story. And, they are used to the idea that there are other people working on the same story. I found that really disconcerting. And I remember being in Norway, reporting, and this other person was there and calling my agent and saying, I can't do this. It's just very uncomfortable. And I sort of regret it. I wish I had just toughed it out. But, and he did write the book, but it kind of vanished into the ether. And I do think it was a great story. And it was a really brilliant opportunity to look at this whole question of captivity and wildness, and does it make sense for us to devote millions of dollars to one individual animal versus spending that money on more general issues regarding animals and wildlife and habitat. But it was a decision that in my gut, I thought, I just don't feel comfortable.
Well, Keiko still appears, so it's not like it was a total waste,
Right. No, and it's really, it's one of my favorite pieces in the book, and I'm so glad that I did it. And there certainly were other stories in the book that, if you pulled the right thread, could have grown into being bigger stories.
One of the things I appreciated about this collection is it struck me, compared to some other collections of journalism, that the pieces didn't feel dated at all. If you're writing a celebrity profile or about a particular company, like a tech company, 10 years, 20 years later, that celebrity might have fallen off the map. That company might be out of business. But animals are animals. A cow is always a cow. There's a kind of a timelessness, like an eternality, that's not even a word, but about the subjects that is really, really cool, because it wasn't until at the end of the book where you list, the dates these appear, that it's like, oh, wow, like this felt like it could have been written yesterday. I mean, that must be something you appreciate as a writer, that this isn't going to feel dated, 10, 20, 30 years from now.
Well, I was thrilled because, these pieces range over an enormous amount of time. And number one, the subjects themselves don't feel dated, but the questions, the bigger questions, if anything, have become more current. Yep. I think we are grappling more and more with the issue of the animal-human interface. I mean, look at COVID, look at Ebola, look at these diseases that we're realizing are crossing into the human population because we are pushing further and further into the wilderness. So if anything, our kind of grappling with the animal world has become more contemporary than ever. I also think that our relationship with animals will be eternal. They're essential to human civilization. So the timeliness will never go away. I think we're always going to have relationships with animals. We're always going to kind of question what it means to have a relationship with an animal, whether it's a dog or a donkey. or a lion, we're always going to be thinking, what does that mean? What can I expect from it? What's appropriate? And I think that I wouldn't have wanted to do a collection that didn't stand up with no awareness of when these were written. And I'm really glad if that's how it feels.
It does. I'm going to go and ask a question that is going to date this conversation to the first week of October and kind of betray the fact that we're pre-recording. And it has nothing to do with the book. It'll be the last question I ask, but I can't help myself. The kind of journalism and literary world for the last 48 hours has been really riveted by a story that appeared in the Times called Bad Art Friend by Bob Kolker, a great journalist. And, for viewers who haven't read the piece, I hope you have, and I encourage you to do so. It's about the idea of a fiction writer borrowing from real life. But I think the idea of writing about someone you know or stealing from someone you know can be applied to nonfiction as well. And so I'm pretty sure you read the piece based on a tweet that I read on your timeline. But as a journalist, as a writer, I'm kind of curious what you made of the discussion this piece has sparked and kind of the idea and the lines that are crossed in this debate, I guess.
Well, it's so interesting because as somebody who writes nonfiction, in an odd way, I'm sort of inoculated against this issue, which is if I'm going to write about my friend who donated her kidney, I'm going to use her name and the story. I'm not going to invent a fictional character who does what my real life friend does. So nonfiction writers, in a sense, are really safe from this very tricky area of and this has come up before. This isn't the first time this question has arisen because it happens all the time. Fiction writers are always borrowing from real life. And it makes sense. It's where they get ideas. That Proust did it. Everybody does it. And the question of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, there is no simple answer to that. I also think that the reason the story became so viral is that it's also about the dynamics of a friendship.
Yeah.
And the really cringy aspect of this, which is one person thought the other person was a friend and the other person evidently thought the person A was kind of laughable and a little ridiculous. And, if you're interested in the dynamics of friendship, or in this case, also a woman who thought she was part of a little kind of clique, only to discover that this clique made lots of fun of her. I think people are responding to that part of it as much as to the more kind of moral issue of can you borrow? But I mean, look, who could write fiction without borrowing or being inspired by real life? But if someone used my life as a model in their story, I would find it very uncomfortable. I mean, who wouldn't?
Well, you kind of went through that with adaptation in a way.
Oh, you're right. Absolutely. And that was with my understanding and my permission and my agreement and my, getting even the legal agreement, which is where film and fiction are quite different. In film, you would never portray someone's life without getting legal documentation that they agree to it. And fiction, these are operating in really different worlds in terms of the amount of money. I mean, the part of the reason that film companies would never develop a film without getting legal permission is that they're going to invest 25, 30, 50, $100 million in a movie, and they don't want somebody to file an injunction the day before the movie comes out and lose all their money. So they're very cautious about it. Now, does this happen in fiction? Of course not. People don't generally feel the need to get a legal release. But because of that, you get into these crazy situations where you say, hey, that is obviously me in your story. What do you do about it?
What do you do?
I mean, we're going to be talking about this for a long time because I think, again, it's one of those, this is where the world gets interesting. It's not the black and the white, it's the gray. And this is very much the gray, which is what's right, what's fair, what's moral, what's appropriate, what's fact, what's fiction, who owns their life story, and what is the nature of artistic invention. And, there is no correct answer, but it's a really provocative topic.
One last question. What's next for you? And I know it's not writing an animal story.
Well, I have a very cool project that I'm undertaking for the New Yorker that I'm not quite ready to say what it is, but it'll be really fun, really cool, a regular feature in the New Yorker. And I'm writing a memoir.
Wow.
Caving into the inevitable and writing a memoir. And that's something I've resisted. And I still have moments of deep doubt where I think, who cares about my life? Why would I write it? Who cares? Who would ever want to read a memoir of my life? But I've had an interesting life. And the story behind the stories that I've done, I think, is actually interesting.
Well, Farmville, the final essay in this collection, is almost like, it felt, knowing that, like almost a dry run. I mean, it's the closest thing to memoir in the collection, and I found it very engaging. So if there's more of that, I think you've made a wise choice. However, memoir is the one nonfiction genre where you can be accused of kind of betraying somebody. If you're going to be writing about childhood friends and family and they don't know, you could find yourself in hot water.
Right. Well, it's interesting. One of the most prickly topics in the book, coincidentally, all the people who I would have been most worried about have all passed away.
Oh, there you go.
So there's a certain relief in that. I have to admit, I mean, I don't mean to be celebrating the fact that they're not alive, but one person in particular where it would have been extremely uncomfortable, I now don't have to worry about that. But yeah, I mean, you think, well, wait a minute, it's my life. I can write about it, except of course you're writing about other people. And I'm acutely aware of that. And I have no interest in making someone uncomfortable. And I really did wonder how I was going to contend with that. And mostly that's gone now as a worry.
Excellent. Susan, I look forward to reading it whenever it hits shelves. And as always, it was a pleasure to talk to you today.
It's great to talk to you, Mark. And let's go horseback riding in Iceland again sometime soon.
Good. It's a deal.
Ooh, that sounds like fun. This has been an amazing conversation. I enjoyed it so much. Susan, the idea that you're coming out with a memoir fills me with delight. In the meantime, to our viewers today, this wonderful book is available at our festival bookstore here on Granville Island. It's also available at your favorite independent bookstore, wherever you may be tuning in from. I highly recommend you go out and grab a copy of this book. Mark, thank you for this wonderful interview. Susan, please join us in person at the festival here in Vancouver, maybe next year.
I would love that. And fingers crossed, I really would love that. Thank you so much.
Goodbye to both of you. Be well. You have been listening to Books and Ideas Audio, a presentation of the Vancouver Writers Fest. To hear more events like this one, please visit our website at writersfest.bc.ca.